This winter is going to be a little different than some of the winters we've seen recently, as shifts in multiple global weather patterns look to set the stage for a unique winter forecast this upcoming season. For some parts of the country, that'll mean more cold air and more snow as we push into the winter, and for other parts of the country, that could also mean an increase in severe weather. I'm meteorologist AJ Waterman, and this is our forecast for the winter season of 2025 into 2026. Now, winter forecasts are difficult because there are several major players in the game that all come together to make a winter forecast. Some change during the season, while others will stay around most of the season. And I will talk about how each one of these has an effect on our winter forecast. And the first one I'll talk about is the ENSO cycle, the El Nino Southern Oscillation, which does have a significant impact on the winter forecast. And to put this pattern into simple terms, it's basically whether or not there are cooler than average water surface temperatures in the eastern Pacific versus warmer than average water temperatures. This does make a difference because it determines whether or not there is a low pressure system over that area or a high pressure system, which does dictate the weather patterns going into the U.S. And as we look at the eastern Pacific, you can see we have cooler than average ocean temperatures in that area, which means we are in a La Niña. And this will have some effects not only as we go into fall, but of course as we go into winter. And this pattern isn't going to stay the same the entire winter, so there will be some changes. So this is the official ENSO forecast from NOAA, and you can see as we head into the next several months here, from fall into winter, we actually transition from a La Niña from November, December, and January into a ENSO neutral phase going into the second half of winter. This could have some major effects on the forecast, especially towards the second half of the season. So when La Niña is in effect, this is the typical winter setup that we do have across the U.S. Notice how we do have that colder than normal air across parts of the northern plains. We also have some wetter than average conditions from the Pacific Northwest into the Ohio Valley, and that's where we'll most likely have storms develop. On the southern side of that polar jet is where we have warmer but drier conditions generally, and not a whole lot of storm action, so this does tend to quiet things down across the Gulf and going out into parts of Florida. However, for places like New England and the Northeast, still have equal chances of seeing storms, not always getting a blockbuster snowstorm, but there's at least some opportunities of that, but there's also as equal of opportunities to just see basically nothing at all. So there's not a whole lot that we can take away from the La Nina pattern in those areas. And this is what a typical winter pattern looks like under an ENSO neutral cycle, where we don't have either warmer than normal or colder than normal waters in the eastern Pacific. So this allows the polar jet to sag a little bit farther south in some locations, especially for the Midwest, but we will also see more outbreaks of colder air most likely under these conditions. That's the typical setup. But south of the jet, that's where things will be warmer and wetter for the season. Although we won't be dealing with El Nino this winter, this is what El Nino typically looks like. Of course, warmer than average waters in the eastern Pacific. This does allow the Pacific jet to come into the picture, producing wetter than average conditions across the southwest and drier than average conditions across the Appalachians. Meanwhile, a good section of the northern tier of the U.S. does end up with warmer than average weather conditions across the area, and that also leads to lesser snow in some parts of the country and could even push that polar jet into Canada a significant portion of the winter. Although the ENSO pattern is significant, it's not the only thing that controls the winter forecast. In fact, we have a few more things to look at as we discussed earlier, one in particular that does have an interesting setup as we push into the season. So the next factor in our winter forecast actually lies in the northern Pacific, and that's where we have warmer than normal temperatures across a huge section of the area. You can see that here. The last time we had a setup like this was about 10 years ago, back in the winter of 2013 and 14, and this could dictate where the polar jet sets up shop as we move into the winter months. And this pattern is called the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, which essentially means warmer or colder waters in the northern Pacific, either east or west. Right now we have a trend that's very negative, which would indicate warmer than average waters in the northern Pacific, specifically the eastern part of the northern Pacific, and this will affect the jet stream, at least the polar jet, as we push closer to winter. Even over the next few weeks here, we will notice some changes in this polar jet. Notice how it wants to ridge or push to the north near parts of Alaska. This is a response to that warmer than normal water temperature that is in the area, so that will force the jet northward in one location. However, downstream, it's going to force it a bit south. So as we track that jet over the western US, notice how it does start to trough or dip to the south. And this will be an ongoing pattern as we get closer to winter here. This is already showing up in fall. Doesn't mean a whole lot right away, but I do think we'll see wetter than average conditions across a good portion of the Pacific Northwest to start fall, maybe even continue to the early part of winter, and then that will gradually shift farther to the east, bringing colder and potentially snowier conditions to parts of the country. So the fall forecast really doesn't show any significant signs of the trough setting up. However, there is a subtle sign in parts of the northern plains where we could see equal chances of some cooler air. Meanwhile, the rest of the country remains mild. This is not unusual. This is actually pretty expected as we go into that transitionary period. But La Nina falls can lead to milder conditions from time to time. So this really isn't a response of the PDO, but we could still expect some wetter than average conditions in parts of the Northwest. And you can see that here for Oregon and Washington. The Seattle showers will be in full effect with this pattern coming in over the next several weeks here, but drier than normal conditions expected for the Rockies. I don't expect that to last the entire season, but the first few months, this is pretty much the expectation until things start to shift. Over to the East Coast, things will be a bit wetter than average for Florida, parts of the Gulf, but you go north into parts of New England, equal chances of rain, but I could see us staying dry up in this area as well, and even through parts of the Midwest. So the polar jet doesn't usually come too far south in the fall. However, as we shift into winter, we also have another major player in the game here. So not only will the jet naturally come south, but we also have the Arctic Oscillation. If you've ever heard the term polar vortex, this is the pattern that basically controls whether or not the cold air from the polar vortex will come south. This will shift several times, most likely during the winter. So sometimes it goes by week to week. Other times it can last for several weeks to a month. So we're going to be watching this closely going into the winter, as this will dictate whether or not we see significant cold air in the forecast. When the Arctic Oscillation, or the AO, remains in a positive phase, this is where the polar vortex tends to hang out. However, in a negative phase, it tends to push down from time to time, and we could see those cold air outbreaks that we're all too used to across parts of the Midwest and even through parts of the Northeast as well. So I do think we could see the polar vortex from time to time this winter, and that could set the stage for some cold air outbreaks. So as we take a look at a long-range forecast product here, this is not something that's set in stone. It's still ways out. We're talking months ahead of time here, but February of 2026, this model gives us a general idea of what the weather pattern could look like. And notice how we do have those similarities. The warm air over parts of Alaska, the ridge that's there where we have the lines going north towards Alaska, and then the trough in response downstream with the colder air over parts of Canada going into the US. This right here tells us that we may see the polar vortex from time to time and those cold air outbreaks, especially across the Midwest, which I do think is a likelihood as we push into the winter. So now putting together the three biggest players of the winter forecast, this is most likely what we're going to deal with into the upcoming season. The other two will have some effects, but usually more minor than those three. So we will see colder air outbreaks across the U.S., where we could potentially see the polar vortex come down from time to time, especially in the Midwest, but also including the Northeast, especially mid to late winter. On the southern side of the polar jet, it most likely will be warmer than average, and we will see those temperatures stay mild most of the winter, but certainly towards the second half. Aside from temperature, this is what I'm thinking for the storm forecast. We will see an increase of storm activity, more so than we've seen the last few winters. It's just that type of year where there's more opportunity for storms to develop. That will have major factors in some of the country, especially for parts of the Northeast, where we could see an increase in nor'easter activity, but it will depend on if we see the cold air meet up with the storms once again. We've had this problem for several winters, but it looks like we'll have more shots at it, and especially towards the second half of winter. Meanwhile, across the Midwest, it will be the Clipper conveyor belt that sets up shop, especially towards the second half of winter. As those shots of cold air come down, storm systems will ride along the cold air, and we could potentially see some Clippers bring several rounds of light snow across the region, maybe even an increase in snow amounts towards the end of the season. On the southern side of the jet, we could have some active weather, including not only a mix of rain, sleet, and snow for some storms, and maybe even severe weather across the south. I do think this will be prevalent going into the early part of winter. We have pretty warm waters in the Gulf right now, so that will help to fuel severe weather outbreaks, which we will probably see several of going into the late fall and early winter, so definitely be aware of that. Otherwise, on the West Coast, it does look like you're going to be dry. However, early winter will probably yield to some decent snows. So if you want to get some skiing in, like myself, you'll probably want to do it a little earlier in the season than later as things start to dry out. So one important part of this forecast that has a lot of variability is the Northeast, because nor'easters are dictated by another pattern that could shift the storm's track east or west. This will have significant impacts whether or not we see major storm systems in the Northeast, but this pattern does change quite a bit as we move into the season. The North Atlantic Oscillation, or the NAO, is a major driver or killer of nor'easters, as it's driven by pressure patterns out in the Atlantic Ocean that can either suppress or drive the development of coastal storms along the eastern U.S. When the NAO is positive, the jet stream remains flat, which suppresses storm system development. However, when the NAO is negative, the jet stream tends to dip quite a bit to the south, and that does allow a good scenario for nor'easters to develop. So with the cold air factored in from the ENSO neutral cycle and the potential for the NAO to change to negative during the second half of the winter, that could yield at least a couple big snowstorms across the Northeast. So this will be something we watch very closely as we push into the season. So the fifth and final factor that we have that affects the winter forecast is the Madden-Julian Oscillation, which actually takes place out in the Indian and Pacific Oceans. This has an indirect effect on winter forecasts across the U.S. by actually strengthening the overall jet across the globe. So this pattern actually helps to increase or decrease storm development from time to time, and it does vary from a few weeks to about a month. So we'll be watching this one as well, more closer to winter, more so than, say, the ENSO cycle or even the Arctic Oscillation or the PDO. So there are some effects from this, but they tend to vary throughout the season. So winter forecasting can be pretty difficult, and some locations may not experience exactly what I just forecasted there. But as we head into the winter season, this is what you can expect on average. So most of the time, snow starts falling in parts of northern Montana in the mountains by September. That expands through a good portion of the Rockies in October, spreads into the Northeast and the Midwest by November, and then starts getting its way into the southern plains, even parts of the Mississippi Valley and Ohio valleys by the time we get to December, and then all the way to the southeast by January and February. Of course, down there, it's not guaranteed, but this is on average when the first snowfall does fall. So here's some important takeaways from the winter forecast. We are most likely going to see some colder than average weather across the Midwest. I lived in Wisconsin. I know how bad the polar vortex can be sometimes, but we'll probably see it a few times as we go into the winter. More coastal storms, of course, as we go into the second half of winter. With the NAO turning negative and also the ENSO neutral cycle, we have some opportunities for nor'easters. Whether or not that actually turns out to be snow in parts of New England, that really all depends, as we still have a significant snow drought in that area over the last few years. And we'll also have an increase of severe weather, most likely, with those storm systems developing across the south and then pushing up into the Northeast. Especially early in the winter, we will probably see at least 1 or 2 severe weather outbreaks, and then drier across the West Coast, more so towards the second half of winter. So get outside and ski early if you're out on the West Coast. It doesn't mean we're going to see a completely dry winter, but drier than average, certainly towards the second half. If you made it toward the end of this video, thanks for watching. Feel free to like and subscribe. We'll have more winter weather updates as we push closer to the winter season.